It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, the kind that felt slow and peaceful. The sun was bright but not too hot, and families were moving in and out of the local supermarket. People carried shopping bags, pushing carts filled with fruits, bread, and weekend snacks. Inside, the store smelled like freshly baked bread and ground coffee. It was the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happened. A man walked in holding a small list in his hand. He was calm and looked like anyone else doing weekend shopping. He wore a plain gray hoodie and jeans, nothing that drew attention. He nodded politely to the greeter and headed straight toward the produce section. He liked to shop early in the afternoon before the place got too busy. He worked for the federal government, but no one there would have guessed that. When he was off duty, he liked to live simply and quietly. He had spent the morning cleaning his car and talking to his neighbor about fixing a fence. The supermarket trip was just one small errand before heading home. He picked up some bananas, a carton of milk, and a loaf of whole wheat bread. He was checking his phone for the rest of the list when he noticed someone watching him. At first, he ignored it. It wasn't unusual for people to glance at each other in a store. But this felt different. He could sense that the person's eyes didn't move away. A few aisles over, a local police officer had just stepped inside the same store. He had been on patrol for hours and was stopping in for a quick coffee before heading back to the station. He was known around town, though not everyone liked the way he handled things. Some thought he acted too fast, made judgments too quickly. Others said he let his pride control his actions. As the officer walked in, his eyes landed on the man in the hoodie almost immediately. Something in his expression changed. He didn't recognize the man, and for some reason that made him uneasy. Instead of minding his own business, he decided to follow his instincts, or what he thought were instincts. The man in the hoodie moved to the cereal aisle, comparing labels. He didn't notice that the officer had stopped near the end of the aisle, pretending to look at something on the shelf while actually watching him. The officer's hand rested near his belt, where his radio and holster hung. Minutes passed. The man reached for a box, looked at the back, and placed it in his cart. He noticed in the reflection of the metal shelf that the same person was still standing there. That uneasy feeling returned, but he stayed calm. Years of training had taught him to keep his cool in uncomfortable situations. He moved toward the dairy section. The officer followed again, this time more openly. A couple of shoppers noticed and exchanged quiet glances. They could sense that something strange was going on, but no one spoke up. The man turned, looked directly at the officer, and spoke in a calm voice. "Is there something wrong, officer?" The officer hesitated. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. His tone came out sharper than he intended. "Just routine. We've had some reports about suspicious behavior in the area." The man blinked, surprised. He looked around. People were shopping peacefully, kids sitting in carts, an older lady picking apples. Nothing suspicious about this scene. He looked back and said, "I'm just shopping." The officer didn't respond right away. He stepped a little closer and asked, "Can I see some identification?" The man frowned slightly, not in anger but confusion. "For what reason?" he asked. "Just standard," the officer said, his voice low but firm. By now, a few shoppers nearby were pretending to browse, trying not to stare but curious. The air around them felt heavy. The man took a deep breath and reached slowly into his pocket. His movements were calm, measured. He pulled out his wallet and flipped it open. Inside was a government badge. "Here," he said gently. "I'm with the federal agency." The officer's eyes narrowed. He looked at the badge but didn't move closer to inspect it. For a brief moment he looked unsure, but instead of stepping back, he folded his arms. "What are you doing here?" he asked again, still suspicious. The man kept his voice level. "I live nearby. I came here to get groceries. That's all." The tension between them grew. No one was shouting, no one was being rude, but there was something uncomfortable about the exchange, something that made the people in the aisle slowly back away. The man didn't want a scene. He had dealt with tense situations before, but never like this. Not when he was just being himself, doing something as normal as shopping for food. He could feel his heart beating faster, not out of fear but out of frustration. He wondered why the officer had picked him out of all the people in the store. He tried to end the conversation politely. "Officer, if there's nothing else, I'd like to finish shopping." But the officer didn't move. "You said you're with a federal agency. You have any proof of that besides a badge?" The man paused. He knew this kind of talk. It wasn't about proof anymore. It was about pride and suspicion. He didn't want to argue, so he said, "My identification is in my wallet too. You can check if you'd like." Before he could open the wallet further, a small group of shoppers turned the corner, talking and laughing, breaking the tension slightly. The officer stepped back, pretending to look at a shelf again. The man decided to take the chance to walk away. He pushed his cart toward the checkout line. The officer followed a few steps behind, still watching. One of the cashiers noticed and whispered something to another employee. The atmosphere felt uneasy now, even though nothing dramatic had happened yet. The man placed his items on the counter, trying to focus on the small things. The beep of the scanner, the sound of the grocery bags rustling. He smiled politely at the cashier. The officer stood a few feet away, his hand near his belt again, still waiting for something. When the man finished paying, he took his bags and started walking toward the exit. He could feel eyes on his back, not just the officers, but other shoppers too. People could sense tension even without knowing the story. Outside, the air felt cooler. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the strange feeling. He had dealt with high-pressure situations before, but this one stayed with him. It wasn't about danger. It was about being seen as something he wasn't. The officer stepped outside too, watching from near the door. He seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to keep following or let it go. For a few long seconds, they just looked at each other. Neither said anything. Then the man spoke first, his voice calm but clear. "You should be careful about how you look at people. Not everyone's what you assume." The officer didn't respond. He just turned and walked back inside. The man stood there for a moment, then slowly walked toward his car. He placed the grocery bags in the trunk and sat behind the wheel. He stayed there for a few minutes, staring out the windshield, letting the moment sink in. Inside the store, a few employees talked quietly about what had just happened. Some said it was nothing, just a misunderstanding. Others said it didn't feel right, that the officer had gone too far. The security cameras had caught the exchange. The store manager, who had been watching from the office upstairs, frowned as he replayed the footage. It didn't look like a normal check or question. It looked personal. The man started his car and drove off, still thinking about what had happened. He wasn't angry, but he couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling. He had done nothing wrong, yet he had been treated like a suspect. He thought about how quickly people could make judgments, how often small things turned into something bigger for no reason. For him, it wasn't just about one officer or one moment. It was about a deeper issue that he had seen too many times. The kind of thing people talked about but rarely saw up close. He didn't know that the short encounter at the supermarket was about to turn into something much larger. Something that would spread beyond the store, beyond the town, and become a story the whole country would soon hear. That afternoon, as he pulled into his driveway, he looked at his groceries on the seat beside him. It had started as a simple trip, an ordinary errand, and now it felt like a reminder that even in ordinary moments. The next morning started quietly. The streets were still wet from the light rain that had passed overnight. The supermarket parking lot looked the same as always. Cars pulling in, families walking inside, people chatting about their weekend plans. From the outside, nothing looked different. But inside the store, the memory of what had happened the day before was still fresh. The employees couldn't stop talking about it. Some had seen the moment up close, others had just heard bits and pieces. The manager had watched the whole thing on the security footage, and though it hadn't turned into a full-blown scene, he could feel it had crossed a line. He had already saved the video clip just in case someone asked about it later. The local officer who had followed the man in the hoodie came back to the store that morning, pretending like nothing unusual had happened. He greeted the cashier, ordered a coffee from the in-store cafe, and walked around with an air of confidence. But some of the staff looked at him differently now. They had seen how uncomfortable the man had looked the day before, how polite he had been, how calm, and yet how suspiciously the officer had treated him. One of the cashiers whispered quietly to her coworker, "He's the one from yesterday." Her coworker nodded. "Yeah, I don't know what his problem was. That guy didn't do anything wrong." The officer noticed the whispers, though no one said anything to his face. He tried to brush it off, convincing himself he had only done his job. In his mind, he had followed procedure, but deep down he felt a strange mix of pride and doubt. Pride because he thought he had acted responsibly, and doubt because of how people were now looking at him, like they had lost a bit of trust. Across town, the man from the day before was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He had slept poorly, replaying the entire situation in his mind. He had handled difficult situations before, but this one felt different. It wasn't part of his work, it was personal. It had happened simply because of how he looked, and that thought sat heavy on him. He had decided not to make a complaint right away. Instead, he wanted to focus on his work and clear his mind. But as he opened his laptop, an email popped up from one of his colleagues. It read, "Hey, I heard something strange happened yesterday." "You okay?" He sighed. News traveled fast even when you tried to keep it quiet. He replied briefly, assuring his colleague that he was fine, though he didn't go into details. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, especially when it involved another law enforcement officer. Still, a small part of him wondered whether staying silent was the right thing to do. He believed in fairness, and he believed that people should be held accountable for their actions, especially those who wore a badge. Later that day, the local police chief received a call from a city resident who had been in the supermarket during the incident. The caller wasn't angry. She was concerned. She said she had seen an officer act in a way that didn't seem right, and that the man he confronted had handled himself calmly and respectfully. The police chief listened carefully. She had been on the force for over 20 years and had seen many kinds of behavior, good and bad. She believed in fairness and accountability, and she had worked hard to build trust between the department and the community. So when she heard this story, she knew it was something she couldn't ignore. She asked the caller for details, thanked her for reaching out, and then requested a copy of the supermarket security footage. That afternoon, the chief sat in her office with the blinds half open, the light from outside cutting across her desk. She played the video on her screen. There was no sound, but she could see everything clearly. The man shopping quietly, the officer following him down the aisles, standing too close, asking questions. She watched as the man pulled out his wallet and showed his badge. She saw how the officer didn't back off, how he stood stiff and cold instead of de-escalating. The chief paused the video and leaned back in her chair. She rubbed her forehead, disappointed. She knew this wasn't how her department was supposed to look. The man in the footage had shown no sign of being a threat. He had stayed calm and respectful the whole time. The officer, on the other hand, looked like he had lost his sense of judgment. She replayed the moment again, this time paying attention to the faces of the people around them, the nervous glances, the distance they kept. It was all there. After a few minutes, she called for her assistant. "Get me Officer Collins," she said quietly. The officer arrived not long after, his usual confident stride showing none of the tension that was about to unfold. He stepped into the office, smiling faintly. "You wanted to see me, Chief?" She nodded and gestured for him to sit. "Yes, I did. I've been made aware of an incident that took place yesterday at the supermarket. I'd like you to tell me what happened." He straightened up, his tone suddenly formal. "It was just routine, Chief. I got a call about suspicious behavior at the store, so I went to check. I noticed a man acting in a way that caught my attention. I approached him, asked for ID, and he said he worked for the federal government." The chief raised an eyebrow. "And did he show proof?" "Yes, ma'am. He had a badge. But, you know, these days anyone can carry something that looks real." She kept her voice steady. "Did he do anything threatening? Did he make any sudden movements or show signs of aggression?" He hesitated. "No, but he was defensive." The chief looked at him firmly. Defensive or just questioning why he was being followed while shopping? The officer opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't have an answer. The chief took a deep breath. "I've seen the footage. You followed him through half the store. You approached him without cause. You ignored clear identification when it was presented to you. And from what I can see, you made a lot of people in that store uncomfortable." The officer shifted in his seat. "With all due respect, Chief, I was just trying to be cautious. I thought he might—" She stopped him. "You thought wrong. And that's exactly the problem." The room went silent. The sound of distant phones ringing down the hallway was the only thing breaking the quiet. The chief leaned forward, her voice calm, but firm. "Our job is to protect and serve, not to intimidate or assume. That man did nothing wrong and you know it. You let your bias lead you instead of your training. That's unacceptable." The officer looked down, his jaw tight. He wanted to argue, but he knew it wouldn't help. The chief stood up. "I want you to take the rest of the day off. We'll be reviewing this matter further. I expect honesty in your written report, and I suggest you think carefully about what you put in it. He nodded stiffly, stood, and left the office. When the door closed behind him, the chief sighed. She didn't like disciplining her officers, but she cared about what was right. Incidents like this could undo years of trust built with the community. Later that evening, she made a few phone calls. One of them was to a contact in the federal office confirming the man's credentials. The moment she got confirmation that he was indeed a federal agent, her concern turned into urgency. The next day, she arranged a private meeting with him. He arrived at her office quietly, still polite but clearly wary. She stood up to greet him, extended her hand, and thanked him for coming. He nodded. "I wasn't planning to make this official," he said softly, "but I appreciate that you reached out." "I watched the footage myself," the chief replied. "What happened wasn't right. I'm sorry you were treated that way." Her sincerity was clear, and for the first time since that day in the store, the man felt a small sense of relief. They spoke for a while, calmly, respectfully. The chief asked about his perspective and what he thought could be done differently. He didn't ask for punishment, only fairness. "I just want people to think before they act," he said. "That's all," the chief nodded. "You have my word on that." When he left her office, she sat quietly for a moment. She knew what she had to do next, and she knew it wouldn't be easy. By the time evening fell, the story was already starting to circulate quietly among local officers and townspeople. No one knew all the details yet, but whispers spread about an off-duty agent, an unnecessary confrontation, and a chief who wasn't afraid to take a stand. It was only the beginning, but it was enough to make people pay attention. The supermarket incident wasn't over. In fact, it was just the start of something much bigger that would test loyalty, fairness, and what it truly meant to wear a badge. The next few days passed slowly, but the air around the police department felt heavy. People whispered in the hallways, trying to piece together what had happened between one of their own and the man at the supermarket. Most of them hadn't seen the footage yet, but word spread fast. Everyone knew the chief had called the officer into her office and that something serious had been said behind closed doors. The officer came back to work the following week, trying to act normal. He greeted people, cracked small jokes, and sat at his desk like everything was fine. But there was an uneasiness in his body language. His usual confidence had faded a little. He could feel that his co-workers looked at him differently now, not with open hostility, but with quiet judgment. He told himself he didn't do anything wrong. He had followed a hunch, that's all. Still, a small voice inside him kept repeating the chief's words. "You let your bias lead you instead of your training." That line stuck in his head. Meanwhile, across town, the man who had been stopped at the supermarket was back at work. He was sitting at his desk reviewing reports, trying to put the entire experience behind him. His co-workers didn't ask too many questions, but they treated him with quiet respect. They knew something unpleasant had happened, even if he hadn't shared the full story. He wasn't bitter, but he was reflective. He thought about how small misunderstandings could grow into something dangerous if not handled carefully. And he couldn't shake the thought of how calm he'd had to remain, just to keep things from getting worse. That afternoon, he received an unexpected call. It was the police chief. She wanted to meet again, this time with someone else present, an internal affairs representative. He hesitated for a moment before agreeing. He wasn't looking for punishment or revenge. He only wanted fairness, but he also knew that silence sometimes allowed bad habits to continue. If speaking up could help prevent another person from going through something similar, then maybe it was worth it. The next morning, he arrived at the police department. The front desk officer recognized him and guided him toward the chief's office. The chief stood up as he entered, greeting him warmly. The internal affairs officer sat quietly beside her, notebook in hand. "Thank you for coming again," the chief began. "We're conducting a review of the situation. You're not under any pressure to participate, but your perspective matters." He nodded. "I understand." The meeting went smoothly. He explained what had happened at the store from start to finish, how he'd been followed, questioned, and treated with suspicion despite showing clear identification. He didn't exaggerate. He just spoke plainly. The internal affairs officer listened carefully, occasionally taking notes. "You handled yourself well," he said softly at one point. "You stayed calm when most people would have gotten angry." The man gave a small smile. I've learned that anger doesn't fix misunderstanding, but accountability does. When the meeting ended, the chief thanked him again for his professionalism. As he left the building, she turned to the internal affairs officer and said quietly, "We need to address this properly. It's not just about one person, it's about the message it sends." That afternoon, the chief called the officer back into her office. This time her tone was serious but not harsh. "I've reviewed everything," she said. "The footage, your report, and the statement from the individual you confronted. I've also spoken to witnesses at the store." He shifted in his seat. "Yes, Chief," she continued. "You had no reason to suspect wrongdoing. There was no call about suspicious activity. I checked the dispatch logs myself. You acted entirely on assumption." The officer's face tightened. "I thought," she stopped him gently. "I know what you thought. But thought isn't evidence. You have to understand the impact your behavior had. You made an innocent man feel unsafe while doing something as ordinary as shopping, and that's not something I can overlook." He didn't respond. The chief leaned forward slightly. "I've served long enough to know when someone makes an honest mistake. But this wasn't just that. This was poor judgment rooted in bias and whether you meant it or not." The silence stretched between them. Then she added, "I'll be forwarding my recommendation to the board. There will be consequences." The officer nodded slowly, his shoulders heavy. "Understood, Chief." When he left, the chief sat still for a long time. She didn't like seeing anyone lose their career, but she couldn't allow behavior like that to go unchecked. Her duty wasn't just to her department. It was to the people her officers served. Later that evening, the man who had been stopped at the supermarket received another call, this time from a local reporter. Somehow news of the incident had started to circulate, though no official statement had been made. The reporter asked if he was willing to share his side of the story. He thought carefully before answering. "Not yet," he said finally. "Let's wait until the investigation is finished. I don't want to make this about me. It's about something bigger." The reporter respected his request and promised to reach out later. Over the next few days, the story spread quietly through the town. People started to talk about it at coffee shops, community centers, and even at the supermarket itself. Some said the officer had overreacted. Others tried to defend him, saying maybe he'd just been cautious. But one thing was certain. Everyone was talking. The chief knew that sooner or later she'd have to make a public statement. She prepared her words carefully, wanting to be truthful without stirring unnecessary conflict. She wanted people to see that accountability wasn't about division, it was about integrity. By midweek, the police board met to discuss the case. The atmosphere in the meeting room was tense. The officers sat at one end of the table, the chief at the other. Board members reviewed reports, statements, and footage. One of them finally spoke. "It's clear this situation could have gone differently." The civilian acted calmly, followed instructions, and identified himself. There was no threat. The officer's approach created unnecessary escalation. Another member nodded. "It's important that the public sees we take these matters seriously." After an hour of discussion, they reached a decision. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about accountability and public trust. Later that day, the chief called the officer into her office one last time. Her voice was steady but firm. "The board has reviewed everything. Based on their findings and in line with our code of conduct, you're being placed on administrative leave effective immediately." The officer's eyes flickered with disbelief. "You're suspending me?" "It's more than that," she said quietly. "You'll be relieved of duty pending final review. You may not return to active service until the investigation is complete." He didn't argue this time. He just stood, nodded once, and walked out of the building, his badge and gun left on the desk. The news spread by evening. Local channels reported that an officer had been suspended after an incident involving a federal agent at a supermarket. The chief's short statement emphasized fairness, professionalism, and accountability. The man who had been stopped saw the report on TV. He sat in silence for a while, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that the truth was out, and sadness that it had to come to this at all. He thought about the chief, about how rare it was for someone in her position to act so quickly and transparently. It gave him a small sense of hope that change was still possible, that maybe things were starting to shift in the right direction. A few days later, he went back to the supermarket for the first time since the incident. The same cashier recognized him and smiled nervously. "I saw the news," she said quietly. "I'm sorry that happened to you." He smiled gently. "It's okay. I'm just glad it didn't turn into something worse." People in the store seemed to recognize him now, though they didn't say much. There was a quiet respect in the way they looked at him. Not pity, just understanding. As he picked up his groceries, he noticed a small group of teenagers near the fruit section. They were talking about the story, not realizing he was nearby. One of them said, "That guy stayed calm even when he was treated wrong. That's real strength." He didn't say anything, but the words stayed with him. When he walked out of the store that day, the sun was bright and warm. The world around him looked ordinary again. Cars driving by, people chatting, children laughing. But he knew that something had changed, not just for him, but for the whole community. People had seen what had happened. They had seen how calmness could overcome confrontation, and how truth could stand quietly but firmly until it was recognized. He took a deep breath and got into his car. The road ahead looked long, but for the first time since that afternoon, it felt like a road worth traveling. He didn't know that the next chapter of this story, the one that was about to unfold, would reach far beyond his small town. It would draw attention from higher officials and spark a conversation about what justice really meant when the uniform itself was in question. And though he didn't ask for any of it, he was ready to face it, with the same calm, steady patience that had carried him through from the very start. Days turned into weeks, but the story didn't fade. What had started as a quiet misunderstanding inside a supermarket had grown into something much bigger. People around town were still talking about it. Some supported the police chief for taking action so quickly. Others thought she had been too harsh. But one thing everyone agreed on: this incident had shaken things up. The man who had been stopped tried to live his life as normally as he could. He went to work, spent time with his family, and kept to himself. But everywhere he went, people recognized him. Some would approach and say kind words, telling him they admired how calm he had been during the whole thing. Others would simply nod with quiet respect. He appreciated it, but he also felt uncomfortable being seen as a symbol. He had never wanted attention. He only wanted fairness. To him, what happened wasn't about fame or anger. It was about how easy it was for people to make assumptions without knowing the truth. Meanwhile, inside the police department, tension was still high. The chief had made it clear that bias and poor judgment would not be tolerated, but not everyone agreed with her decision. Some officers quietly defended their suspended co-worker, saying he had just made a mistake. Others said the chief had done the right thing, and that the department needed to change. The chief could feel the division growing. Every time she walked through the station, the conversations would stop mid-sentence. She had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when people were uncomfortable with leadership decisions. But she didn't regret her choice. She spent her evenings reviewing department policies, especially around community engagement and training. She wanted her officers to understand people better, to see beyond surface appearances and act with empathy first. One morning, she received a call from the city mayor's office. The mayor wanted to discuss the supermarket incident. The chief straightened her uniform, gathered the necessary files, and drove to City Hall. The mayor greeted her politely but got straight to the point. "This story is spreading beyond our city," he said. "News outlets are calling, and community groups are asking for a statement. We need to be careful with how we handle this." The chief nodded. "I understand, sir. I've taken action internally and the matter is under review. I also plan to introduce new training focused on judgment and communication." The mayor leaned back in his chair. "Good, but we also need to manage public perception. The people want transparency, and the department's reputation is on the line." "This isn't just about one officer, and it's about trust," she agreed. "Trust is built through actions, not words. I'll make sure we handle this properly." That afternoon, she held a closed meeting with senior officers. The atmosphere was tense at first, but the chief spoke calmly and clearly. "We all know why we're here," she began. "An incident occurred that should never have happened. The question now is what we learn from it. We can't undo it, but we can make sure it doesn't happen again." Some officers nodded silently while others avoided eye contact. One finally spoke. "Chief, people make mistakes. Are we really going to let one mistake ruin a career?" The chief looked at him and replied, "Mistakes happen, yes. But when mistakes come from prejudice, they can destroy lives. That's not something we can overlook." The room went quiet again. Everyone knew she was right. In the following days, the chief began organizing a new community outreach program. She invited residents to share their stories and experiences with local police officers. It wasn't meant to shame anyone. It was meant to build understanding. The first meeting was held in a small community center near the supermarket. Chairs were set up in neat rows and the room filled quickly. Some people were curious, others skeptical. A few officers attended as well, unsure of what to expect. The man who had been stopped that day decided to attend too. He sat quietly in the back, not drawing attention to himself. When the meeting began, the chief stood at the front. She spoke simply, without notes. "We're here to listen," she said. "Not to argue, not to defend, but to understand." One by one, community members shared their thoughts. Some talked about feeling nervous when they saw police cars, even when they hadn't done anything wrong. Others talked about positive experiences, times when officers had gone above and beyond to help. The man listened carefully, nodding at some of the stories. When the chief finally asked if anyone else wanted to speak, he raised his hand. The room turned quiet. He stood up slowly and said, "I didn't plan to talk tonight, but since I'm here, I'll say this. What happened to me wasn't about anger. It was about how quickly someone judged me without knowing who I was. I don't blame all officers. I just want things to be better for everyone." His words were soft but powerful. People in the audience nodded. Some officers looked down, thinking about what he had said. When the meeting ended, several people came up to thank him for speaking. The chief approached and said quietly, "You didn't have to come, but I'm glad you did." He smiled faintly. Sometimes silence doesn't change much. Sometimes people need to hear it from someone who's lived it. That night, a local reporter covered the meeting, writing about how it brought the community and police together in a new way. The article didn't sensationalize anything. It focused on empathy, understanding, and the power of listening. The next morning, the chief received messages from nearby cities asking about her community program. Some wanted to copy it, hoping it could improve relationships between residents and law enforcement in their own towns. At the same time, the officer who had been suspended stayed mostly at home. He avoided the news, but he couldn't escape it entirely. Friends texted him about the story spreading online. Some people defended him in comments, but many criticized his behavior. He didn't know how to feel. He was angry, embarrassed, and confused all at once. He told himself he hadn't meant any harm, but when he looked back, he could see how his actions had been unfair. One afternoon, he received a letter from the department. It was short and formal, a request for him to attend a disciplinary hearing. He knew this was it. The decision about his job would be final after that. The hearing was scheduled for the end of the week. The chief would be there, along with members of the review board. The man from the supermarket was also invited, though he wasn't required to attend. When the day came, the weather was calm. The air felt still, like the world was waiting. Inside the meeting room, everyone sat quietly. The officer looked nervous but tried to stay composed. The chief sat across from him, her expression serious but fair. The hearing began with a summary of the incident, followed by a review of the footage. Everyone watched silently. The man's calmness in the video was clear, as was the officer's tense, suspicious posture. When the board asked if the officer wanted to speak, he hesitated before saying, "I made a judgment call that day. I thought I was doing my job. But after seeing the footage again and hearing what others said, I realized I was wrong. I let my assumptions control me. I didn't see the person in front of me, I saw what I feared. And that's on me." His voice shook slightly, but his words were honest. The room stayed quiet. The board members exchanged glances. After a short break, they returned with their decision. The chief stood and read it aloud. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty. Your conduct does not reflect the values of this department. This decision is final." The officer lowered his head. He didn't argue. He stood, nodded to the chief, and walked out of the room slowly. Outside, the man from the supermarket was standing quietly near the exit. They locked eyes for a moment. The officer stopped, then said softly, "I'm sorry." The man nodded once. "I know." It wasn't anger or triumph, just a quiet moment of understanding between two people whose paths had crossed in an unexpected way. That evening, the chief held a brief press conference. She spoke with honesty and dignity. thanking the community for its patience and reaffirming the department's promise to do better. She didn't focus on punishment. She focused on growth and trust. The story spread widely after that, not as a scandal but as a lesson. People across the country talked about the importance of awareness, fairness, and accountability. And for the man who had once just been shopping on a quiet Saturday, life slowly returned to normal. But he carried something new with him, a belief that even the smallest moments could lead to real change, if people were willing to listen and act with heart. The days after the hearing felt quieter. The news channels stopped running the story every hour, but the echoes of it still lingered in the city. People had moved on to new headlines, yet this one had left a mark that wouldn't disappear easily. For the man who had been stopped that day in the supermarket, life finally felt like it was returning to normal. He could walk into a store without people staring or whispering. The first few times it happened, he'd felt awkward, people pointing him out as that man from the news. Now most had stopped noticing. He appreciated the quiet. But even as the attention faded, something inside him had changed. He found himself thinking more deeply about people, about how quickly situations could shift from ordinary to frightening. He had always believed that most people meant well, but now he understood how fear and assumption could turn simple moments into something dangerous. He decided not to dwell on anger. Instead, he focused on understanding, not only for his own peace of mind but also for others who might find themselves in similar situations. He began speaking quietly with community leaders, helping them organize small gatherings to talk about fairness and communication. He never saw himself as a teacher or activist, but he realized that sometimes sharing an experience was enough to open someone's eyes. One evening, he was invited to a local college to talk about what happened. He wasn't sure at first. Public speaking wasn't his comfort zone. But the organizer told him, "You don't need to give a lecture. Just tell your story." When the day came, the room was filled with students, teachers, and a few local reporters. The man stood at the front holding a microphone loosely in his hand. He started simply. "I went shopping one day like any other person. I didn't expect to end up in the news. But here's what I learned. People see what they expect to see. Sometimes that's good. Sometimes it's not." He talked about the moment the officer approached him, how quickly things escalated, and how calmness saved him. He didn't speak with bitterness. His tone was steady, his words honest. When he finished, the room was quiet for a few seconds. Then someone began clapping, and soon everyone joined in. Afterward, several students came up to thank him. One young man said, "I've had people judge me before too, but hearing you talk about staying calm, that helped." The man smiled softly. He realized then that maybe what had happened wasn't just a bad memory. Maybe it could help change something in others. Meanwhile, at the police department, the chief's new community programs were beginning to take shape. Officers were attending workshops about communication, empathy, and understanding different perspectives. The chief made sure the sessions weren't just about rules. They were about people. Some officers struggled at first. They weren't used to discussing feelings or personal bias. But slowly, as they listened to community stories and shared their own experiences, things began to shift. One officer said during a session, "I didn't realize how nervous people get just seeing a uniform. I thought they'd feel safe. Now I understand it's not always like that." That comment started a conversation that lasted an hour. It was honest, and for the first time in a while, both sides were truly listening to each other. The chief noticed something else too. Morale was improving. The officers felt more connected to the people they served. The tension that once hung heavy in the station began to ease. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Outside the department, the town's local newspaper published a follow-up story about the positive changes happening since the incident. The headline wasn't dramatic. It simply read, "Community finds healing through listening." Readers responded warmly. The comment section, usually filled with anger and arguments, was full of thoughtful messages. Some shared personal stories of misunderstanding, while others thanked the department for taking real steps forward. As for the former officer, he had been quiet since leaving the force. At first, he avoided public places, not wanting anyone to recognize him. He felt the weight of his mistake every day. He knew he couldn't change what had happened, but he also didn't want to live defined by it. After a few weeks, he decided to reach out to someone, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. He called the police chief and asked to meet. The chief was surprised but agreed. They met in a small cafe outside of town, away from cameras and headlines. He arrived early, sitting nervously by the window. When she walked in, he stood up, unsure what to say. The chief greeted him calmly and sat across from him. He spoke first. "I just wanted to say thank you for how you handled everything. I know it wasn't easy, and I know I made things worse." The chief looked at him thoughtfully. "You made a mistake. But what matters now is whether you learn from it." He nodded. "I have, more than I thought I would. I used to think being a good officer meant acting fast and being firm. Now I see it's about understanding first. I wish I'd realized that sooner." The chief gave a small, tired smile. "We all keep learning even when it's uncomfortable. I don't hate you for what happened, but I hope you use what you've learned to do something good." He promised he would. That conversation stayed with both of them for a long time. A month later, the man who had been stopped in the supermarket received a letter in the mail. It was from the former officer. The letter was short but sincere. It read, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted to thank you for how calm you were that day. You could have made things worse, but you didn't. That day changed me. I see things differently now. I hope you're doing well." The man read it twice. Then he folded the letter carefully and put it away. He didn't feel anger, only relief. It felt like a chapter closing. Time passed, and the story became one of those local legends people mentioned when talking about change. New officers heard about it during training. Some said it was the moment their department started truly listening. The chief continued her work, pushing for reforms and building bridges between the community and the police. She often reminded her team, "We're not just here to enforce rules. We're here to protect people, and that starts with understanding them." The man continued his quiet life, but every so often, he'd receive a message from someone who had seen a video clip or read about the story online. They'd thank him for how he handled himself. He always replied the same way, "Stay calm, stay kind." One afternoon, while sitting in the same supermarket where everything began, he noticed how peaceful it felt. People walked by pushing carts, talking softly. No tension, no fear. He smiled faintly to himself. The world wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But maybe, just maybe, people were learning. A few weeks later, the town held a small community event celebrating acts of fairness and courage. The chief was invited to speak, and so was the man. Neither of them knew they'd both been asked. When the chief stepped on stage, she spoke about teamwork, honesty, and how leadership meant owning mistakes, not hiding from them. She didn't mention the supermarket story directly, but everyone knew what she was referring to. When it was the man's turn, he said something that made the whole crowd quiet. "What happened to me could have gone very differently. I'm thankful it didn't. But the real change came afterward in how people chose to learn, not just react. I believe things can get better if we keep trying to see each other as human first." The audience applauded softly at first, then louder. It wasn't the applause of entertainment, it was respect. Later, as the event ended, the chief approached him. They shook hands quietly. No speeches, no cameras, just two people who had seen how fragile trust could be, and how powerful it was when rebuilt. That night, as the city lights flickered and the air cooled, both of them went home feeling something rare and peace. The man sat on his porch, thinking about everything that had happened, the fear, the misunderstanding, the lessons, and finally, the calm after it all. He realized that sometimes, the hardest stories to live through are the ones that end up teaching everyone else the most. And though he never asked to be part of a lesson, he was proud that out of something painful came something good. A reminder that compassion and understanding could be stronger than fear or judgment. Months passed and the city began to settle into a quieter rhythm. The story that once dominated local news had faded into the background, but its impact still echoed in quiet ways. The supermarket incident had changed more than just one man's life. It had changed an entire community's way of seeing itself. For the man who had been at the center of it all, life had become peaceful again. He still went about his days the same way. Early mornings, a cup of coffee, quiet walks, and evenings spent reading or sitting on his porch. The difference was on the inside. He saw the world through softer eyes now, more patient, more understanding. Sometimes people would still recognize him, especially older folks who remembered the story from the news. They'd smile or stop to say hello. A few would thank him for the way he had handled everything with calm and dignity. He always responded humbly. "I just tried to do the right thing," he'd say. But what really moved him were the younger people who'd come up and say, "You made me think differently about how I react when someone judges me." Hearing that made him realize something powerful. Sometimes the biggest change doesn't come from what you say, but from how you act when it matters most. The police chief, on the other hand, had kept her promise. The department had transformed over the past few months. The training programs she'd started were now a permanent part of the system. Officers learned about emotional intelligence, body language, and community engagement alongside their usual duties. It wasn't just about preventing mistakes. It was about changing a culture. She wanted every officer to understand that their badge wasn't just a symbol of authority, but of trust. She reminded them often, "People don't need us to be perfect. They just need us to be fair." The results were starting to show. Complaints from the public had gone down. More people were attending community meetings, and the atmosphere at those gatherings was no longer tense or defensive. People were finally talking to each other instead of talking past each other. One evening, the chief received a message from the city council. They wanted to honor her for her leadership and the reforms she'd introduced. She hesitated at first. She didn't want personal praise. But she accepted the invitation because she knew the recognition wasn't really about her. It was about what the whole city had accomplished together. When the ceremony took place, the hall was full. There were officers, city officials, families, and local residents, even people who had once criticized the department. The atmosphere felt warm, hopeful. As she walked to the podium, she spotted a familiar face sitting in the crowd, the man from the supermarket. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and she smiled. When she began to speak, her voice was steady. "This recognition belongs to everyone here," she said. "Change doesn't happen because one person demands it. It happens when people decide to listen, truly listen, to one another. We can't undo the past, but we can make the future better if we keep learning and caring." Her words drew gentle applause. After the event, she made her way through the crowd and stopped beside the man. "I didn't expect you to come," she said. He shrugged lightly. "I figured I should be here. You've done good work." She smiled, a little tired but genuine. "So have you, whether you meant to or not." They shared a quiet moment. Two people bound by an event that had started painfully but ended with something meaningful. Over the next few months, life moved forward. The former officer who had been dismissed started volunteering at a local youth center. At first, he wasn't sure anyone would want him there, but he offered to help with mentoring programs, teaching young people about self-discipline and decision-making. He never talked much about his past, but word got around. Some of the kids asked him directly one day, "Weren't you the officer from that story?" He paused before answering. "Yeah," he said quietly. "And it taught me more than anything else ever has. You can't judge people by fear or assumptions. You've got to see them for who they are." The kids nodded. They didn't look at him like a villain or a hero, just a man who had learned something the hard way. And that was fine with him. Meanwhile, the city's sense of unity continued to grow. The police department organized monthly community picnics where officers and residents shared food, stories, and laughter. Families brought their kids. Officers played ball with local teens, and people who had once been wary of each other now smiled in greeting. At one of those gatherings, the man was invited again, this time not to speak but simply to be part of it. He sat under a tree, watching families laugh and children run around. A young officer approached him, carrying 2 cups of lemonade. The officer handed him one and said, "I joined the force last month. During training, they told us about what happened here last year. It changed the way I see my job, so thank you." The man accepted the drink with a small smile. "Just do it right," he said. "That's all anyone really wants." They both laughed softly. It was a simple exchange, but one that meant more than either of them probably realized. As summer rolled into autumn, the story that had once divided people had become something else entirely. A quiet reminder that change was possible. Chico. News occasionally revisited the story, but not as a scandal. They called it the turning point. The reporter who covered it last wrote, "In a small city where fear once caused a moment of misunderstanding, compassion has built a bridge. It began with one man's calm, a chief's courage, and a community's choice to listen." One evening, as the sun set behind the city, the man found himself walking past the supermarket again. The parking lot was busy, carts rattling, people chatting as they came and went. He stopped for a moment near the spot where everything had happened. The air was cool, filled with the hum of everyday life, exactly how it should be. For a moment he thought back to that day, the confusion, the fear, the voices, the flashing lights. But instead of bitterness, he felt peace. He realized that he didn't think about that moment with anger anymore. It had been painful, yes, but it had also led to something good: understanding, growth, and even forgiveness. He walked into the supermarket, grabbed a basket, and went about his shopping like any other day. The cashier smiled at him when he checked out, and he smiled back. Simple, human moments, the kind that keep the world gentle. That night, as he sat on his porch with a cup of tea, he looked up at the stars. The neighborhood was quiet except for the soft sound of crickets. He thought about the chief, the former officer, the community, and all the people who had somehow been touched by that single day. He realized something important. Sometimes life puts you in the middle of something you didn't ask for, not to test you, but to teach you, to make you see things that others might miss, to remind you that even when things seem unfair or frightening, patience and kindness can turn them around. He smiled to himself and whispered softly, "It's all right now." In another part of the city, the police chief sat in her office late that same evening, finishing paperwork. She paused for a moment, leaned back in her chair, and looked out the window. The streets below were calm, the lights steady. She thought about how far they'd come, not just as a department but as people. She had seen officers change, residents open up, and trust slowly rebuild. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. She reached for a small notebook she kept on her desk and wrote a single line before turning off the light. Real strength isn't in authority, it's in understanding. Outside, the city glowed softly under the night sky. The man and the chief didn't cross paths often after that, but they didn't need to. They both knew that sometimes the best kind of ending is a quiet one, not filled with noise or attention, but with peace. And so, what began as a frightening misunderstanding ended as a story of change, reflection, and hope. A reminder that, even in the most ordinary places, extraordinary lessons can unfold. Because in the end, it wasn't about the supermarket or the officer or even the headlines. It was about people, imperfect, emotional, human, finding their way back to understanding. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful ending of all.